Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Green Book from 2018. Now, this is a movie that I don't think was on a lot of people's radar, or was only on their radar in a very limited capacity, for a couple of reasons. And weirdly enough, I should say weirdly enough, it performed apparently very well overseas, while it didn't perform super well domestically. This is an interesting thing for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is this is a profoundly American story. It's very specifically about a specific time and place and cultural dynamic and a lot of American history, for better or for worse. But I think one of the reasons, at least for me, that I had hesitated to watch it up to this point was mainly two things. One, the first I really heard about it was during award season, when it was starting to get nominated for a bunch of awards. And based on the theatrical poster and a couple of other elements about the way it was presented, it looked a little bit Oscar baity. If you know what I mean, then you know what I mean. I'm not going to delve into that again. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. You can have something that's oriented towards that kind of interest without, compromising it in any way. The other part of it was the name. And I think the name is a big mistake, but only if you know what it means. So, for context, the Green Book refers to the Green Book. I'm not going to say the full name of it, because it's even a little bit suspicious to say the full name. That was used by Black people, mostly in the South. Its intention was for Black people who were traveling through the South to be able to have a guidebook that was written by other Black people in order to find out where they could eat and sleep and use the bathroom and get gas and those sorts of things without being harassed. Basically, where are the safe places that we can be that in a sea of places that are incredibly inhospitable or deadly to people who have not white skin tones. And so this was a very important book for a whole lot of people for a very serious amount of time. And it's a very dark thing to have to exist on its face. Like, if you have to, I'm not even going to explain that. It explains itself. It's a horrible thing that existed at all. But for the people who needed it, it was a godsend. And so to me, that said to me that this was going to be a very heavy movie, and one that was going to take a lot of energy out of me to emotionally process. That on top of its fairly long runtime, it's over 2 hours, really said to me that this is something I was going to have to prepare myself for. And surprisingly enough, I did go into this sort of anticipating that. Even now, surprisingly enough, this is a surprisingly, I hesitate to say light, but it's not as hyper dramatic, it is not as Oscar baity as I initially expected. It certainly touches very heavily on some very serious subjects and uncomfortable subjects, and a dark part of the U.S. history and history for multiple different groups. And there's no getting around that. But it does, first, one of the things I want to congratulate it for most is keeping a moderate tone throughout the entire course of it that lets it not be excessively heavy, having its heavy moments where it needs to, not going excessively light and making too much levity or not addressing the issues at hand with enough seriousness, and not making it more palatable in too excessive of a way. It doesn't delve deep into the grotesquerie that might have, been potentially more realistic. But it doesn't need to, because it gets its message across without having to go too far one way or another. So it strikes a very nice balance. This is a really interesting movie partially because it's a historical film to some extent. As I understand it, I'm not going to delve into it, but as I understand it, there's various ups and downs as far as its alleged historical accuracy, and nobody can completely agree. But the two main characters, played by Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali, are real historical people. Fascinatingly enough, I didn't draw the connection until partway through the film, and then reading again after. The character that Viggo Mortensen plays, who is called Tony Lip or Tony Vallelonga, his son, or I think son, is the writer or one of the co-writers on the movie. And he himself, after the events of this movie and having other careers and stuff like that, has also had a not insubstantial career in movies and TV, mostly playing, unsurprisingly, a bunch of Italian mobsters and things in a bunch of films and in The Sopranos and a couple of other things. I didn't realize that part. I also didn't realize that Don Shirley, I didn't connect the dots until they were talking about one of Don Shirley's albums, because that was actually an album that I listened to, that was like had on a record, because anyway, my parents are old. That was in the record collection at home, and occasionally was put on. And so I actually remembered when that record was named, what it sounded like. So that was an interesting connection to make, although I didn't really know anything else about him as a person or as a musician other than remembering that one particular record. This is I don't want to say buddy cop film, but it has some of those similar dynamics of, two characters diametrically opposed. I say buddy cop because that's kind of the most common version of this set of tropes, this framework that we see in a lot of different movies, of two characters from very different parts of their world, whether depending on the film, it is shown in different ways, but we have a working class white guy and a sort of high society black guy in an era where they would not, certainly Don Mahershala Ali's character was sort of out of the ordinary in a whole lot of ways. And I think it's 1962 this is set, and so that dynamic is set up beautifully right off the bat. The establishment of who the characters are, what their beliefs are, how they conduct themselves, their expectations, views, and beliefs about the world are all in the first sort of 20 minutes set up really, really nicely. Sometimes in some very subtle ways, sometimes in some very unsubtle ways, to sort of understand the dynamic that the two characters are walking into. Now, with any buddy film or anything like that, especially one that specifically touches on the subject of race, that can be really susceptible to falling into some unfortunate tropes and even just things like the white savior narrative and those sorts of things. And I think this film does a very good job of not really doing that. The characters both have a lot to learn from each other, and while they don't necessarily, it's delivered in a very natural way. This isn't a case where they immediately take turns fighting and then exchanging information and then learning about each other and becoming bigger people. That eventually does happen, but it's laid out in such a way that the events that they have to go through together make it a much more give and take dynamic, a much more natural pattern of how that ends up happening. And overall, the pacing of the film is really, really good for doing that, and a whole bunch of the other things that it needs to do as a narrative. And to really fill that over 2 hours of runtime very effectively. It does not feel like a particularly long film, to my experience. And that's in spite of the fact that there are some definite periods of like intentional slowness. The movie overall, I think, is intentionally a little bit slow just to let you sort of absorb the scenes and events just a little bit more. And that's funny, actually, because there are a few in the edits. There are a few edits in the film that are a little bit weird. In particular, there are just a few reverse shot edits in a couple of scenes that are really fast paced for some reason in a like whiplashy kind of way, like whiplash in your neck, like not like the movie. And so generally the editing is very, very good with a few very minor, well, not that minor, but outlying exceptions. The casting, I think, is fantastic. Both Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali, I think, have great range as actors. I've seen more of Viggo Mortensen in various things than Mahershala Ali. I think he's had a very long career at this point, probably like 30 years at this point. And I've only seen Mahershala Ali in a few things, but I like him in everything I've seen. But Viggo Mortensen always seems to surprise me a little bit with the amount of range he really does have, even as somebody who does not visually transform as much as certain other actors that I would put in sort of a similar class of, high dynamic actors. So I really appreciate both the actors' performances in this film, and I think they do a fantastic job. As far as visuals and the cinematography, I think this is a real standout for that. And not necessarily in all of the most directly appreciable ways. Sometimes it's just minor, subtle things, good framing, good, rack focusing and certain choices in the type of camera work used in certain scenes to sort of change the intimacy of a scene, or sort of even portray alienation and these sorts of things. I also think that there's one or maybe in two films I've talked about this before. This is also always a little bit weird to talk about, but I think it's always worth acknowledging when it happens. This film, because it does touch on race and has a significant proportion of black characters, I think it needs acknowledgement that it does a really good job of color grading and shooting properly to show the dynamics of black skin. As I've talked about in whatever, I couldn't figure out what video it was before, cinema cameras are typically calibrated to look at white actors. That's just how it is. And that's a whole rabbit hole to get into. I talked about it more in the other video, wherever that was. But having a shots in a film where you can specifically go, oh, somebody actually knew how to work with their camera, with their equipment to shoot this person's appearance properly, is always worth acknowledging. So props to them on that. As far as the sort of overarching, like the arc of the film, like I said, I think it does a really solid job of keeping a good tone, a believable tone, a tone that doesn't go too high or too low. It doesn't shy away from some of the realities, but it doesn't, intend to be preachy or therefore an element of like shock or like historical reminder. It's very much there to tell the story of these two particular characters and their dynamic, and the sort of a character study of how they evolve over the course of spending 2 months together. And while I think the dynamic is a little bit over polished, perhaps, where the believability of certain changes of attitude and acceptance of one another is probably very smoothed over, I think it does a nice job of not making it feel too easy. The conflicts seem serious. The characters seem like they are serious. And, even when they're having their moments of levity, it's not all sunshine and rainbows for anyone. And I think overall it turns out something surprisingly dynamic. I was not weighed down as much as I was worried I was going to be initially coming into this. Overall, I'm just very impressed with this film. I was sort of expecting to be given some of the nods and awards it was put forward for. But this is just, it's really solid and more digestible than I initially expected. And I think that's worth acknowledging for, I think the whole film is very worth acknowledging. I really enjoyed it. And I think if you're able to digest that initial tone, as long as you're ready for that, I think it's a great film to watch. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.